Right, I think we can make a start now. It's almost 5 past. So welcome everybody, thanks for logging in. I'm Marianne Jump, the Archivist and Library Manager at the Marx Memorial Library. This evening's event is one that we're jointly hosting virtually with the SCRSS, the Society for Cooperation in Russian and Soviet Studies, which is a kind of sister organisation, a library based in Brixton, dedicated to promote the knowledge of culture, language and history of Russia and the former Soviet Union. We've got a really strong track record on joint working with the SCRSS, most notably with our international conference on the centenary of the Russian Revolution back in 2017. You'll be hearing from Ralph Gibson, who's joining us on the panel just now, at the end of the event. This evening's panel on historical memory and the victory over fascism marks 75 years since victory over fascism in 1945. And today it's also 79 years since the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June, 1941. This event was conceived of originally in conversations between the MML, the SCRSS, the Soviet War Memorial Trust, and the International Brigade Memorial Trust. Back in October 2019, a motion was passed at the annual general meeting of the IBMT, a charity dedicated to the memory of those who volunteered to fight fascism and defend democracy in Spain in 1936-9. And this motion stated that the IBMT deplored the resolution adopted by the European Parliament on the 19th of September 2019, which ignored the civil war in Spain, made no reference to the Munich Pact, failed to acknowledge the role of the Red Army in the defeat of fascism, and made an equivalence between communism and fascism. That's my attempt at summarising that motion. Now this prompted a discussion between our four organisations, the MML, the SCRSS, the SWMT and the IBMT. And we all have kind of overlapping and complementary commemorative educational and research functions. So we agreed to organise an event. We first conceived of this as two panel discussions, the first examining this attack on the history of the fight against fascism with a panel of authors and historians, what we have this evening, and the second one with representatives from each of our organisations. And this is something that we hope to discuss later in the year and possibly put on a second event. Our three speakers this evening will explore the role of the Soviet Union in the fight against fascism and its defeat in the Second World War, and will reflect on how and why this history is now under attack. Before I go on to introduce each of our speakers in turn, I'll just do a little bit of housekeeping and abuse my position as chair a little bit and say a little bit about the Marx Memorial Library, if that's okay. I've been asking you all to keep your cameras off. That's just so that we don't get cluttered with lots of images and we keep our eyes on the speakers. I've got you all on mute at the moment. The idea is that we will be having a Q&A once each of our speakers have spoken in turn, but we'll be asking you to please direct questions into the chat. And we've got a couple of volunteers who are kind of in the chat room in Zoom, which is just with the speech bubblers at the bottom of your screens. So if you put questions as they occur to you during the session, and then I'll feed them back to our panel at the end. We are recording this, as I mentioned before, so this will all be viewable on our website tomorrow. And it's also live on Facebook, so hopefully we've got even more than our 113 viewers now. Very briefly about the Marx Memorial Library. Despite my virtual background, I'm not actually on site at the moment, which is unfortunate. But we are a historic library, archive and education charity based in Clerkenwell Green. We were founded in 1933 in response to the rise of fascism in Europe, in fact. And we're home to a world-class collection of over 50,000 books, pamphlets, journals and archive collections as well, with specialisms including the Spanish Civil War, the international peace movement, the print trade unions and much more. A major part of our work is education, and that's what these events are all about. Right, I think that's probably enough from me. I'd like to welcome first our first speaker, Phil Katz, he's asked me to mention this, so I'm going to be cheeky and say that he's been a member of the library for longer than I've been alive, since 1976. And he's written 3 books on historical revisionism, including The People Organised Unions on the Home Front, Freedom from Tyranny, and he's also spoken at a Moscow conference in 2011 on this subject. So over to you, Phil. I'll just ask our other speakers to please turn their videos and mics off.
Well, thanks to you, Marianne, and to the library for inviting me to speak in these incredible times. This is such a big topic. Today, it's 79 years since the Nazis attacked the Soviet Union, and much has happened since then. The demise of the USSR has accelerated the return of fascism, fascists, and a revisionist right, and history has become one of their main battlegrounds. These forces are really grouped around an organisation called the Prague Declaration Movement, and they've made a cult out of the German-Soviet Pact. They claim that the Ukrainian famine of 1933 was deliberate, and they've created a new political category of red-brown equivalents, or basically communism equals fascism. If you weren't already confused about politics, you will be after that. They've had a lot of success capturing the centre ground in the EU Parliament last year. So tonight I want to talk about memory and the period 1931 to 1945, the role of the Prague Declaration movement, I'm just going to call them PDM if you don't mind, and crucially whether historical memory can be won and lost and then won again. Historical memory is always going to be contested because it reflects the class struggle. The German-Soviet Pact brouhaha is really used to cover up for the betrayal at Munich in September 1938. Munich truly is the villain of the peace. In September 1938, Hitler demanded land in Czechoslovakia that had a sizable proportion of citizens of German descent, but it also happened to include their main defence lines. And at a meeting between Chamberlain, Hitler, Mussolini and Daladier in Munich, Hitler was given that land and then he proceeded to annex everything else. Munich was Chamberlain's desperate attempt to stop Czechoslovakia from becoming another Spain. The Czechs were better armed, better organised and wanted to defend themselves. And Spain hadn't yet fallen, so Hitler would have had to have contended with a Spain and a Czechoslovakia that was militantly anti-fascist. People knew the importance of Munich at the time. In fact, there are photos of Whitehall which show it blocked right the way up to Trafalgar Square of people demanding support for the Czechs. And Churchill said, England has been offered a choice between war and shame. She's chosen shame and will get war. And the communist MP, Willie Gallagher in Parliament, said of Munich, the national government are not isolating Soviet Russia, they're isolating Britain. And later he said, if I was asked the question, did the Prime Minister save the peace? I would answer with an emphatic no. The Prime Minister saved Hitler. So the net outcome of Munich was to create an unbroken belt of fascism from the North Sea and the Baltic, through the centre and heart of Europe, right down to the Mediterranean. And if a few months later we add Franco, it took that belt from Lithuania to North Africa. The day after Prague fell, a top delegation of the Federation of British Industries, the then CBI, went to Germany to sign an agreement not to compete with German industry and to work together to fix prices and collaborate in export markets. That was 22 weeks before the war started, and it covered the very industries that produced the bombs that were later dropped on British cities. Chamberlain said of that delegation in Parliament, "There's no desire on the part of His Majesty's government to stand in the way of any reasonable efforts on the part of Germany to expand her trade." Within 36 hours, the Nazis had seized Czechoslovakia. They'd taken Memel in Lithuania without firing a shot. The carve-up at Munich took place 44 weeks before the German-Soviet Pact of Non-Aggression was signed. The Czechs weren't even allowed to attend their own funeral. And after Munich, everybody knew it was only a matter of when war would start. You can see why I've made it a turning point issue and why it's so important not to allow the German-Soviet Pact to be portrayed as the spark for war. The twin evils of the 30s are appeasement and non-intervention, which led to a failure to protect legitimate governments in countries like Abyssinia and Spain. The Prague Declaration movement puts the German-Soviet Pact at the starting point of World War II, but they omit the Japanese invasions of China. They ignore the Soviet-Japanese border war of 1931 to 39, the Anglo-German Naval Pact of 1935, the invasion of Abyssinia, the occupation of the Rhineland, the annexation of Austria, the degradation of Spain, grabbing parts of the Baltic, the carve-up of Czechoslovakia at Munich. There's plenty of places to start the war from. With the passing of the war generation, we now have to think and work out how to keep that memory alive. And especially, we need to hear the authentic voice of the people in our history. There were so many wars being fought between 31 and 45. It was a war of classes, a war of new versus declining empires, and a war of socialism and barbarism. And although May 1945 looked like a kind of knockout, it's clear that in many countries, now important in EU policy-making corridors, that actually 45 was unfinished business. So it's not just history that's about class struggle, it's the telling of the history that is a class struggle too. So what is the Prague Declaration movement? Up until the late 1970s, the detailed causes of the war were contested amongst scholars, but there was a general acceptance that the right people won. And if you were ever in doubt, you could just check who was hung at Nuremberg. In 2004, Cameron acquiesced in the addition of 10 new, mainly Central and Eastern European accession states into the EU. And this skewed the whole organisation to the right. Some of the new states, some of those states from the Baltics and to the east, advocated a post-1945 shared European legacy. In other words, there was no difference between those countries which had fought Nazism and those who, in some cases enthusiastically, had joined it. And they realized that the EU could become a means of imposing their view on everybody else. The PDM was founded by a number of ex-presidents of countries like Czechoslovakia and Lithuania, with an array of American backers and ex-dissidents. It was a very well-funded lobbying organization, which promoted the removal of statues marking the victors and the Red Army, the outlawing of symbols associated with the Red Army and the partisans, and the prosecution of anti-fascist heroes for war crimes. The declaration, by the way, was also signed by the European representative of the Dalai Lama, but they keep that one quiet. And it originally called for the reopening of the Nuremberg trials and their extension to putting communists on trial. That's quietly been dropped as well. By June 2008, the Prague Declaration on European Conscience and Communism was published. Its signatories networked and found powerful allies including ex-Prime Minister Thatcher and Sarkozy. But it was successfully resisted here in a parliamentary alliance led by John Mann MP. In fact, only one Briton ever signed the Prague Declaration. The Prague Declaration movement engaged in hardcore obfuscation of the Holocaust. They're clever guys. They didn't deny the Holocaust. They just said it was one of many. This is where they wheel out the Ukrainian famine, deliberately started by the Soviets, supposedly. And then they said, well, of course, the Holocaust never happened in their countries, so it was nothing to do with them. They talk of twin totalitarian systems, but that somehow the communist one was always worse because it lasted longer and involved the denial of the right to own private property. 2010 was a turning point, with things ramped up. An all-party group of MEPs established a common Europe, common history to reconcile the different historical narratives in Europe and to consolidate them into a united European memory of the past. And the outcome sought to impose a common model or view of the war on the school curricula throughout all countries in the EU. This is the start of a serious attempt to equate Nazism and communism, which provoked the legendary Jewish director of the Wiesenthal Center, the great Nazi war hunter Ephraim Zurov, to say that the perpetrators of Auschwitz cannot be compared with its liberators. Later, in August 2010, the EU Parliament sponsored the European Day of Remembrance, and that was supposed to coincide with the signing of the German-Soviet Pact. This is now a fixed day in the EU calendar, but it's a thinly veiled attempt by Prague Declaration movement supporters to take out the much more widely accepted Holocaust Memorial Day. In December that year, the EU Commission was pressed by Lithuania, Latvia, Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania, and the Czech Republic to make the approval, denial, or belittling of communist crimes an EU-wide criminal offence. That would have meant that was a criminal offence in this country, by the way, as we were still members. The Commission was divided. The British representative strongly opposed that and the rationale that lay behind it. But in true EU style, the Commission said it wouldn't stand in the way of constituent countries who wanted to endorse it. And that began in earnest the move in various countries to outlaw the symbols of communism. There are trials going on in Poland now for people who've held up a red flag with a five-pointed star on it. So since that period, a lot has happened. You've had the maiden coup in the Ukraine. Skirmishes are going on all over. In 2018, Poland made it a criminal offence to accuse it of complicity in Nazi crimes. Protests forced a retreat so that it could be considered a civil crime instead. In 2019, the Lithuanian parliament drafted a bill to outlaw any attempt to claim its citizens participated in the Holocaust, even though actual film exists of them murdering Jews en masse before the Germans even invaded. In the Ukraine, more than street names are changing. Stepan Bandera, who was the archetype pro-fascist Quisling, is restored with full government honours, and everyone's given a day off work on January the 1st in his honour. And in 2019, the EU Parliament adopted its joint motion drafted by PDM supporters. The significance of this is that it's a motion which once British Conservatives refused to sign, now endorsed by the Labour Party. That's how far the PDM has travelled. Historical revisionism is no longer a sideshow. It is strategic in the battle of ideas, because when you discuss the outcome of World War II, you are effectively defining the contours of the kind of states and democratic life you want to bring your kids up in. So what can we do? In the past, for example, where communist parties are destroyed, labour movements are quickly suppressed, minorities are left vulnerable to attack, press freedom is erased, and parliaments are broken. You know, the Pastor Niemöller, first they came for the communists. I said nothing because I wasn't one, etc. Well, this process is actually happening now in countries such as the Ukraine, in Hungary, Romania, and Lithuania, and it would also be happening in Poland if it wasn't for mass action by women who are resisting the government diktat. To fight effectively against this notion of red-brown symmetry and obfuscation of the Holocaust, we have to bring together everybody that is under threat. That is democratic life. It's not just about communists. It's not even just about the left. Can these battles be won? I think so, without question. And they have been won in countries like France and Spain. In Spain, the tide has been painstakingly turned against the Franco version of history. In France, on a much bigger scale, during the Cold War onwards, an attempt was made to right the left, the Jewish underground groups and those led by Republican Spaniards and democratic forces out of the history of the resistance. But the trial of Klaus Barbie in 1987 portrayed a very different face of France. And now the left is very much making the running on the true history and account of what happened. Just to conclude, in parts of Europe, but not in Britain yet, we have temporarily lost the accepted version that the war was won for democracy, but historical memories are being constantly fought over. And I believe that we can restore the common agreement established at Nuremberg in 1945 and 1946. Many people don't realize that it was the united front of Britain, France, America, the Chinese as well, but especially the Russians, who were able to show exactly who had been the aggressor. And they showed that at Nuremberg. And out of that unity emerged the United Nations, and then the Declaration of Universal Declaration of Human Rights. If you start to unravel the commonly accepted view established at Nuremberg, you're opening the door to unraveling the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in my opinion. And therefore, everybody who's got an interest in protecting that declaration has an interest in finding a genuine, authoritative and honest account of what happened during the Second World War. Elsewhere in the United Nations, there's also a motion passed each year, similar to the one that now goes through the EU on the anniversary of the German-Soviet Pact. And it's often sponsored by the Russians. I think it's always sponsored by them. And it's a motion to condemn Nazism. It may shock many of you that Britain, for recent years, has abstained in that vote because it was part of the bloc of EU voting states. We're not held to those constraints anymore. And I think that now we're out, we can press to change that vote. There's no reason why the debate shouldn't be had out in local union branches, labour parties, trades councils, and at the TUC, amongst scholars, students in universities and in schools, in veterans groups and in civic organisations. If our war effort was a people's war, why not take the defence of that record to the people? My hope is that tonight we can start to become part of that process. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Phil, for laying that recent history out so comprehensively. We're going to move on now to hear from Dr. Michael Jones. I'm just going to bring him back in. Thanks, Phil. We'll bring you back when we go back to Q&A in just a moment. Right, it's an absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. Michael Jones as our second speaker. I'm just going to put you on the spotlight. Michael's a historian and author, fellow of the Royal Historical Society. He's written a phenomenal number of books on this subject, including Total War After Hitler, Leningrad, Stalingrad, and many more. So it's a real pleasure to have him here this evening. He'll be speaking on myths of the Great Patriotic War, history told by the losers.
Thank you, Miriam, and thank you, Phil. And it's an honor to be speaking to you all. I can't see you all, but virtually to be speaking to you on the 22nd of June, as we've heard, the anniversary of the start of the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa. And I'd like to begin by just invoking how in Russia each year on the 22nd of June in the Museum of the Great Patriotic War in Moscow, the dwindling band of veterans, Red Army veterans, hold an extraordinary and very, very moving ceremony. It's a ceremony of remembrance, and it's held within the Hall of Memory. It's called the Hall of Memory, and it's the most extraordinary place within this great museum. There's music, and Mozart's Requiem is playing softly in the background, and the walls of this hall are reddish brown, the color of human blood, and so much Soviet human blood was spilt. And in the hall, a white marble figure bows her head in sorrow and grief, and the roof is extraordinary. Thousands of crystal pendants hanging from the ceiling, and they symbolize the dead, 27 million of them, soldiers and civilians. The scale of the Soviet sacrifice in destroying the Nazi war machine is unimaginable. And although the scale is unimaginable, at the time, during the war, politically and amongst ordinary people, there was tremendous admiration for the Soviet war effort. That Coventry, which had suffered so much from German bombing, wanted and indeed did twin itself with Stalingrad when Stalingrad was being attacked. When in 1945 American soldiers met Red Army soldiers on the Elbe, and British soldiers met Soviet soldiers, that even though there was an enormous problem with the language, the warmth of feeling was extraordinary, because everyone knew what an achievement it was. Everyone had taken part in it, particularly the big three, the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, but it was also absolutely understood that of those three, the Soviets had borne the brunt in the scale of the German threat and the destruction that was done, and also in turning the tide. And as Churchill said, ripping the heart out of the guts out of the German war machine. So it was an extraordinary achievement, and so extraordinary and so widely understood that one would think that that achievement would be sacrosanct. And there is a dictum that history is a story told by the winners, and certainly military history is a story told by the winners. But I think it's an extraordinary exception that the Great Patriotic War, so this is the war within the Soviet Union from 1941 to 1945, this extraordinary war, perhaps the most brutal, devastating war in human history, is told by the losers. And when we watch we read the history, we watch the documentaries, what we are fundamentally getting is a German view of this war. And this is absolutely extraordinary. And how did it come about? So one reason is ideological, that so soon after the end of the Second World War, we got the Cold War. And the surface justification for Hitler's war against the Soviet Union was a crusade against communism, against Bolshevism. So German generals, now we actually eavesdropped on captured German generals. I mean, we put them in a, this is so British, we put them in a very nice kind of stately home. I mean, they were under guard, but they were allowed to have afternoon tea. Afternoon tea turned out to be the big reveal. I mean, mics everywhere, but afternoon tea, a British habit that the Germans kind of just seem to love. That they were very candid. They said, "Oh my God, this is rather awkward. Were you involved in that massacre of, you know, Russian villages? Oh God, I mean, I saw all those Lithuanian Jews being killed. What are we going to do? Pass the cake? I know. We'll blame the SS. We didn't know about it, so they were starting to construct their own story even while the war was being fought. And then, oh well, what went wrong? Well, we'll blame Hitler." So they were sort of working this out over tea towards the end of the war. And then once the Cold War began, they were jumping with glee. I mean, particularly since their sentences were being commuted. Field Marshal von Manstein, a brilliant German commander, but also involved, the evidence was at the Nuremberg was overwhelming, involved with the deaths of Jews in Crimea and elsewhere. His sentence was reduced massively, 15 years to 3 years, and moved from a prison to a kind of library. So you sort of were told, write your memoirs and tell us how to beat the Red Army. And so what we've then incorporated is a sort of German view of how to beat the Red Army. And the big problem with this is they did not beat the Red Army, they lost. And they lost in absolutely overwhelming fashion. So I'm going to take you on a very rapid steam through the first couple of years of the war, just so you can see how this military falsification works. I mean, it's around emphasis, and it's very much a distorting perspective. And then I'm going to pan out to the bigger picture of what the war was about, because of course, underneath the ideology is the brutal truth that this was a race war, and every German soldier understood this. It was a race war against the people they regarded as subhuman, the Slavs. And this is a nettle that has to absolutely be grasped. But let's look at the military side of things first of all. Well, if we start in the first year of the war, and the German army was exceptionally able. It was remarkably professional. It was light years ahead of the Red Army in so many areas. And in the summer and autumn of 1941, its performance was incredible. But nevertheless, there was not a decisive end to the war. And particularly damning was the German failure to capture Moscow. So this is where the first kind of think tank of Germans sort of rewriting their memoirs. So when in doubt, blame Hitler. So in this version of events, everything is going swimmingly along until Hitler starts meddling and diverts everyone from going straight towards Moscow down into Ukraine. Total idiotic decision, major blunder. Well, this is a post-war fantasy Firstly, German research, recent German research, has shown that Hitler's position in 1941 was simply not strong enough to impose the view that the vast majority of German generals disagreed with. And to take Army Group Center, the German force that was going to be responsible for advancing on Moscow, again, German scholarship has shown that the majority of generals, these are commanders of armies, strongly supported the diversion into Ukraine, which was a phenomenal success. The capture of Kiev, the capture of the grain basket, the Donetsk basin, the industry that was supplying the Soviet war effort, the capture of more than 650,000 Red Army soldiers. And believe you me, interviewing German veterans, they didn't think it was a mistake. They said it was the most astounding military success they'd ever seen. But the remarkable thing about this Ukraine diversion is it totally ignores the view of the winners. So if we look at the memoirs of the great Soviet commanders, Georgy Zhukov, Marshal Georgy Zhukov, he says an attack on Moscow in, say, August 1941 was absolutely impossible. It just wouldn't have worked, and so on and so forth. And this view, which is found in just about every book and every documentary, ignores the views of the commanders, the Red Army commanders, who won the war in the East. It's absolutely astonishing, and also manages to overlook the fact that most of the German view was kind of reinvented after the war. So blame Hitler, and then complain about the weather. So it kind of rains a lot. Well, it normally does rain in October in Russia. And what's left out of this scenario is that the rainy season affected the Red Army as much as it affected the Germans. So the truth about 1941 was rather more unpalatable, particularly if we're dealing with a race war, which was after pulverizing defeats in the summer and autumn. The Red Army got its act together. The achievement in Zhukov in defending Moscow was absolutely incredible, but the whole mood of the army changed. The slogan came into being, Moscow is behind us. And and our armies that had lost the will to fight not only regained the will to fight, but fought with stupendous courage. And it's very, very difficult for German veterans to actually acknowledge they were outfought by the Red Army. They'll normally find every other possible reason. That the way I see it was that in November and December 1941, the Germans were outfought for the first time in World War II. And then very quickly with Stalingrad, it's the same story. Stalingrad, probably the turning point of World War II, that once again, we have a German view that everything was going swimmingly until Hitler made these mistakes. And supplies didn't get through. We're told that bombing Stalingrad created a lot of rubble that the Red Army could fight in. When the civilian downtown Stalingrad was bombed on the 23rd of August 1942, 60,000 civilians lost their lives in one day. This is the equivalent to Hiroshima, between 40 and 60,000 civilians. And the Luftwaffe, this was von Richthofen, who bombed Guernica in the Civil War, Spanish Civil War, deliberately targeted the civilian areas, not the factories, to create panic. And he very nearly succeeded. The city was on the verge of collapsing, but it didn't collapse. So these constructs were not shared at the time. And then the complaint, Hitler forced the highly mobile German army into an attritional war it was not suited for. Well, German veterans in September 1942 said, we're in a war of attrition and we'll win it because we're better. And in October, they found out to their horror that they weren't, that the Russians found a sense of purpose, a will to defend the city that was based on extraordinary patriotism, love of Mother Russia, and also tactically better than the Germans. And with reluctance, some German soldiers admit that the Russians were better at that kind of fighting than they were. And so it goes on. So the military view is a view of the losers, and it doesn't correspond to the experience of the winners at all. And I can't find another example in history where we have such an extraordinary turnaround of events. And of course, it wasn't just a series of military events, but underneath the ideological justification, it was a race war. It was a war of extermination. It was a war of extermination where the Holocaust was practiced. And remember, it was the Red Army that liberated the first fully functioning death camp at Majdanek in Poland, in Lublin in Poland. It was the Red Army that liberated Auschwitz, and they had to fight to liberate it. But alongside the Holocaust, which was practiced widely within Russia and Ukraine, the massacre at Babi Yar, perhaps one of the earliest examples in September 1941. But we should also remember the mass extermination of Russian prisoners of war in the winter of 1941 to 2, between 3 and 4 million Red Army prisoners of war were left to starve in camps. It was the first colossal war crime. It's not talked about very much, but Germans who did talk about it were thoroughly ashamed. And then there was genocide in Belarusia by 1944. Between 4 and 5 million people had been killed in a deliberate policy of extermination. It was called anti-partisan, but basically by 1944, it was mass extermination. So this was a war where Russia was fighting for its very survival. And its achievement in winning this war was extraordinary. When one meets Red Army veterans, and it's an extraordinary privilege to meet them, they're humble men, but they're very proud of this achievement, and they have every right to be. And they acknowledge how strong the Germans were, and it is incredible that they outfought them. And I think that the deepest reason for that was to do with the fact that they had a cause worth fighting for. And I just want to read very briefly from one German captain, Wilhelm Rosenfeld, and he wrote this in his diary in August 1942. He said, "What is happening in the occupied territories, these are territories that occupied by the Nazis within the Soviet Union, will work more and more strongly against us. The starvation, the mass disappearances, all are manifestations of Nazi terror. One day, when the Red Army goes onto a general offensive, these people will rise up against their persecutors. For all those we attack have been given a moral cause to fight for the liberation of their country, and this will inspire self-belief and courage. But what are we fighting for? We sleepwalked into this terrible conflict and no longer know how to bring it to an end. And we carry too much blood guilt on our hands to receive a shred of sympathy from our opponents." It was a flawed triumph, and we know about the things the Red Army got wrong, the failures in discipline, the lootings, the rapes, although we often forget what the soldiers had been through and what they'd seen as they liberated villages from the Nazis. But we need to remember that the vast majority of Red Army soldiers fought this war with dignity and astonishing courage. And if we lose sight of this truth, we not only diminish and distort the story of the Soviet Union's heroism, but we diminish our whole story, because it's the reality that together, Britain, the United States, and we can add France, and that's mentioned, we can China and everything, that we fought and destroyed fascism. It's very difficult for people at the end of, some people at the end of World War I to work out what that war was really about, ordinary people. But no one was in any doubt what the war was about at the end of World War II. You went into a cinema and you saw Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, where incidentally medical teams, Russian, British, American, very much like our extraordinarily brave health workers, volunteered to stay in those very dangerous places to help the sick and to try and bring them to recovery. The Great Patriotic War was a shared achievement that we can be really proud of. And if we forget that legacy, we diminish it for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that evocative account of the history and the associated historiography. That's fascinating. I'm now going to bring on our final speaker. I'm just going to bring on Jonathan. Right, it's a great pleasure to welcome our third and final speaker, Jonathan White, who is a trustee of the Marx Memorial Library, one of our tutors, associate editor of our journal Theory and Struggle, and a trade union official who's written a lot on this subject already. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thanks very much, Marion, and thanks to the first two speakers for fantastic contributions. I suppose I'm speaking here really because in a couple of Morning Star articles recently, I wrote about the political expression of revisionism around the Soviet Union and its role in the defeat of European fascism, and about the true extent of fascism in Europe, as it was expressed in the European Parliament motion that Phil referred to earlier. Now, although in his excellent talk, he gives a much fuller history of the Prague Declaration movement and explains that that motion is by no means the only, or even perhaps the primary site on which this battle over historical memory is being waged. But it was the one that caught my eye, I suppose, particularly because of the role, as Phil's already alluded to, of social democrats in that resolution. They voted with enormous discipline to support that motion as a bloc. And that seemed to me to present us with a real challenge. And I want to talk briefly, I suppose, about why I think this revisionism about the Soviet Union and its role in the defeat of fascism is so very dangerous right now. I want to suggest it's part of an ongoing Cold War in historical memory whose aim is threefold. Firstly, to create amnesia about the social content of the Soviet Union. Secondly, to obscure the scale and role of European fascism. And finally, to divide the working class movement both within itself and from its own history. And in the process, as Phil and Mike have both explained, it seeks to rewrite the history of the Second World War as an episode in a European struggle for liberty against totalitarianism, with two acts, one that ended in 1945 and a second that ended in 1989. And this is explicitly stated in the recent EU Parliament resolution, for example. Now, the notion of totalitarianism is of central importance to this ideological offensive. It's a staple of interwar European liberal democratic thought. It was mobilized with great effect during the Cold War to elide the differences between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany in particular. It's a political concept that focuses our attention on the absence of, or presence or absence of, multi-party democracy and the central institutions of liberal democracies like a nominally free press. Now, its great value for the ruling class and its apologists is that it allows a complete elision of the differences between the Soviet Union and Nazism. And of course, they were massive, because the USSR, for example, had no capitalist labor market. It had social ownership of vast expanses of means of production in several different forms. In other words, its property relations were profoundly different from those of Nazi Germany, in which dictatorial and terroristic political structures overlaid a highly monopolized industrial capitalist state. And this, of course, is precisely the benefit of the Marxist analysis that we attempt to build into our education work at the Marx Memorial Library, which calls on us to look beneath the surface appearances of any society and examine what is taking place within its property relations, how its superstructure is related to its basis. Now, the concept of totalitarianism works in reverse by calling on us to ignore the property relations and, in the process, of course, ignore the revolutionary transformation of social and economic life that was unleashed within the Soviet Union. And it's doubly important for revisionism to obscure these forces because the inconvenient truth is that they played the leading role in the defeat of European fascism. In May 1940, it took Nazi Germany 6 weeks to completely defeat the major military power in the West, France. The following year, as Mike's already explained, the fascists invaded the Soviet Union. They occupied the industrial regions of the Ukraine. They took control of 2/3 of its coal production, 60% of its iron production, half of its steel production, and destroyed 40% of its food-producing machinery. Yet through its basis in planning and socially owned property relations, the Soviet state was able to take decisions that enabled the rebuilding of an industrial base in the Urals and elsewhere, deploying the latest industrial organizing and manufacturing techniques, and drawing on huge reserves of commitment, ingenuity, and skill among its people, what Marx would call its productive forces. By the summer of 1943, the Soviet Union was outproducing Germany in tanks and aircraft, and played the central role in the defeat of Germany and its allies, Hungary, Romania, and it's often forgotten, Italian forces. Italian losses on the Eastern Front were instrumental in the falling prestige of Mussolini's fascist regime. And this brings me on to the second point I want to make, which is about the way in which revisionism and its use of the term totalitarianism obscures not only the social and economic content of fascism, but its scale and its scope. Because if you read the revisionist propaganda, Nazism and the Holocaust appear almost like an embarrassing accident that was suffered by the German people. Yet Nazism was one form of a wider fascism in whose name were ruled the peoples of Germany, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Vichy France, and Hungary. And it was fascist control of state power in Italy, Germany, and Spain, and fascist expansionism that drove Europe towards a cataclysmic war, as Phil's already explained. This war unleashed an orgy of barbarism that was motivated, as Mike said a minute ago, in part by the racist ideologies of fascism. The appalling atrocities that took place across Europe, the mass killing of political opponents, of ethnic Slavs, homosexuals, Roma people, and of course the genocide of the Jews, was not only the work of German Nazism, it was actively supported by fascists and their sympathizers in Holland, in Vichy France, Hungary, Bulgaria, Ukraine, and the Baltic states. And of course the German army's behavior in Russia itself, systematically murdering its way across the Soviet states, was rooted in a racist ideology towards Slavs and was an attempt not just to defeat Bolshevism, but to create a new racist world order on the basis of slave labor. And this work had sympathizers and supporters in every European state, including Britain, which had its own fascist fifth column inside its ruling class. This is a dirty and inconvenient truth that is being actively erased by revisionism, and it's a central ideological plank of the rehabilitation of fascist political forces across Europe and indeed across the world. The final thing I want to say is about this, the way in which this revisionism works to divide the working class within itself from its potential allies and from its own history and historical consciousness in the present. This work is most obvious in the way that it seeks to drive a wedge between communists and all those who have sympathized with or see value in the actually existing socialist states, past and present, and wider labour movements and progressive forces. The concept that there is a thing called Stalinism, which needs no explaining, is rooted in the currency given to the notion of totalitarianism and the exclusive focus on the absence of multi-party democratic practices and structures in the state. It is used to drive a wedge between working classes in the capitalist states and solidarity movements with states like Cuba, and to generate the kind of hostility we see being generated on the world stage today towards China, and it attempts to drive communists and the sympathizers with actually existing socialism to the margins of labor movements and so on. But it also divides the working class movement from its own history, because Marxists and communists have been an organic part of the working class movement since the late 19th century. From 1917 onwards, sections of the British working class have positively identified with the Soviet Union and communist parties right from the days of the hands-off Russia movement in 1919 and 20. Communists played leading roles in the progressive changes that are now broadly celebrated by labour movements and progressives everywhere as part of their shared heritage. The resistance movements against fascism in the 1940s, the anti-colonial and anti-apartheid struggles. Communists led trade union struggles that won a higher standard of living for workers in what's now celebrated as having been the golden age of capitalism, benefiting from a global balance of forces rooted in the sheer existence of the Soviet Union. They were not the only forces, and they were certainly not the leading ones, but they were there, and their contribution was real. Now, revisionism that seeks to ostracize the communists and the Marxists as part of a totalitarianism, which is only overcome in 1989, and which was historically aligned in this imagination with Nazism. This is an abomination that seeks to alienate the working class movement from its own history and erase the memory, exactly as Mike was saying about the Great Patriotic War being part of a shared common heritage. I think that's exactly right. It's designed to erase the memory of the historic crimes of fascism and open the door to a new era of barbarism. And the challenge we face now is how to wage a battle of ideas against this work. And I'm sort of going over the territory that where Phil ended up here. And the extent of that challenge, as I said at the outset, I think was demonstrated by the actions of the Social Democrats in the EU Parliament. It seems to me that the times call on the labour movement, on Marxists, and on all who understand the nature of fascism to begin to discuss how to win a wider understanding of these issues within the labour movement and beyond. The Communist Party, for example, recently highlighted the origins of historic fascism in the capitalist crisis of the 1920s, the dangers posed by the current phase of capitalist crisis beginning in 2008 and continuing through the coronavirus pandemic. Now, as then, it is the big corporations who stand to gain above all, as smaller businesses and smaller producers are crushed and working class organizations are targeted. Fascist forces are on the rise across the world. And once again, the world's big businesses flirt with these political forces in order to crush working class resistance and permit greater expansionism. So the basis and the necessity exists to build a new popular front, as Phil was saying, of all anti-fascist forces, a broad alliance of all those who are not prepared to see big business and fascism turn working people against each other, and to make them pay a grievous historical price again, to undergo a second period of global barbarism. Such an alliance must have a historical consciousness, an understanding of the historical conditions that led to the rise of fascism, the social basis of fascism, and the real forces that led to its defeat. I think we need to begin to organize a battle of ideas. Phil's contribution talked really illuminatingly about the way in which the Prague Declaration movement have organized themselves. Now, they benefit hugely from wealthy funders, obviously, but they organized over time and targeted institutions. And that is precisely what I think we need to start to do now. Not just challenging the concept of totalitarianism, for example, in books and articles, but mapping the different fronts in the struggle, identifying who our allies are or might be, and targeting them, building new organisations that can conduct this ideological work. As part of organising the political forces that can challenge the rise of fascism and its basis in big business's response to the current crisis, we need to begin work to build a historical dimension to a kind of a new people's front that can challenge the growing power of fascist apologism before it's really too late. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for bringing that all up to date and starting to look at the challenges and opportunities ahead as well. I'm now going to bring in the rest of our panel, just bring everyone back. Unmuting everybody. We're nearly all here. Right, I think we're all back. A massive thank you to everybody on our panel. I think that was really interesting. We've got quite a few questions to get through now. Before we do, I'd like to ask Ralph Gibson, Honorary Secretary of the SCRSS, our co-hosts, to say a few words.
Well, I'd like to join Marion in thanking the speakers for a fascinating series of contributions, and I think it reinforces Marion and our view that this kind of event and panel is vitally important in starting the process of starting the conversation about what is happening. As the SCRSS and the Soviet War Memorial Trust, of which I'm also on SEC, these conversations need to be had across a broad spectrum, and I think events like this, I hope we've drawn in people who aren't necessarily fully aware or as aware as they ought to be about the history of that vital period up to 1945. I was privileged today to be at an event to mark the 79th anniversary at the Soviet War Memorial with the Russian ambassador. Very small event because of the circumstances, and I hope that perhaps next year for the 80th anniversary there is a larger a more substantial event. But interestingly, amongst this discussion has been the recent article by Russian President Vladimir Putin, which of course has been utterly trashed by the Western media. But interesting, if you read the article, which I think Marion is going to send out links to the article, but many of you may already have read it. He's not necessarily saying that they have all the answers or all the truths, but he's starting a very serious conversation particularly amongst the Allied powers about coming to a common view of the Second World War, or restoring, perhaps we should say, the common view, because I think Mike has alluded in 1945 there was a common view that fascism had been defeated by an alliance between three countries which, under normal circumstances, wouldn't have had anything to do with each other, or certainly with the Soviet Union. So I think I'd like to see contributions from other world leaders, responses to Vladimir Putin. That will be fascinating. But I would certainly like to invite anybody who wants to find out more about what we've been talking about tonight. I'd urge them to find out more about Marx Memorial Library. The Society for Cooperation in Russian Soviet Studies has a vast archive in Russian and in English related to the Second World War and the whole Soviet period. And of course, finally, the Soviet War Memorial Trust and its work involved in the creation of and the continued events connected with the Soviet War Memorial in London, which happens, of course, to be located next to the Imperial War Museum. And its role in a very basic, simple way of reminding people that 27 million, an unbelievable, unimaginable figure, 27 million people, Soviet citizens and military personnel, lost their lives in the defeat of fascism, and that must never be forgotten, and it must always be remembered. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ralph. Right, well, I've got a number of questions I'm just going to pose to the panel and ask you to kind of hop in. It's slightly awkward sharing this on Zoom, so let's just do our best. I'm going to start with one which I think opens up a broader theme of the arts and culture and the role that they play in the kind of battle for historic memory. Why do we never have English language films about the Soviet war effort? This contributes to our broader ignorance. Anyone want to come in on the cultural sphere and the arts?
Are you asking us?
Yes, I'm asking you as the panel.
Just a quick response is that if people go onto YouTube, MOS Films, MOS Films, have uploaded all of their films from the 1930s, 40s and 50s for free, most of them dubbed into English. And there's one extraordinary film which is about 5 hours long in 3 parts on the post-Stalingrad war effort, an Operation Bagration, called The Direction of the Main Blow, which takes the battles of Orel right the way into Berlin. And it's a kind of partly done by actors, partly using documentary film that I can assure you you'll never have seen before. So a lot of that film footage is available free and in English on YouTube.
Yeah, and I just add to that, there's a channel called Russian Film Hub. There's a link on the SCRSS website, which again, it is specifically Soviet films, or Russian and Soviet films, with English subtitles or dubbed. And so you can pick up a lot of material from another perspective. But I would agree that Western filmmakers have not really addressed the war on the Eastern Front very much.
No, and in the 1980s, there was that extraordinary period where we had so many innovative Soviet Spring and filmmaking, and a film called Come and See, which is about a massacre of an entire Belarusian village, and it's seen from the point of view of the child, and it's exceptionally powerful, and it's based on an actual series of studies of, I mean, it's harrowing in the extreme of what happened in Belarusia in 1944. And beyond the tapestry of military maneuvers, that children, civilians were impacted upon so strongly, and of course this was true universally, that a child's eye view of the suffering, I think, is particularly powerful. It's very powerful in terms of the Holocaust, but it's also very powerful when we see, and one thing that's never commented on is that when Stalingrad was bombed, the population of Stalingrad had gone up from 450,000 in 1941 to 900,000. That jump was orphans, children who'd lost their parents, and many of whom had come from besieged Leningrad. Talk about going from the frying pan into the fire, and had been taken to Stalingrad because people thought it was safe. So in a way, part of the power of Soviet film is broadening the lens. So we move away from military maneuvers to see the impact on the entire population.
Marion, if I can come in on just very quickly on that, I think, you know, I think an answer to that question is broadly that, of course, the culture is the culture is reflecting the broader political changes that have taken place. I mean, if you, and I sort of illustrate this slightly with in relation to sort of I suppose, sort of serious efforts to televise the history of the Second World War. If you the world at war now, that, you know, if you revisit the world at war now, uncommon understanding that I think that Phil talked about of who was responsible and and were the right people being punished for it at the end, it does underpin that series to an extent. Now the Russians were quite unhappy with it because it actually only features 3 episodes to do with them, and it's much more to do with the imperial, and that reflects the audiences, the British and American audiences, and their concerns with their global war efforts as well. The Russians are unhappy with it and commissioned their own series called The Unknown War, I believe. I think it's called that, and you can't now get that. Not only can you not access that in Britain, as far as I'm aware. It was narrated by Burt Lancaster, and that's hard to imagine that something like that would happen now. But not only that, but the world at war itself is no longer that understanding is no longer general. That was what the war was about, and if that series were to be made now, it would look very, very different.
Thank you, Jonathan. There's quite a lot of people making suggestions in the chat, which is interesting, so do take a look. Okay, the second of our questions here is about historiography, really. How does the revisionist history deal with sources? For example, in recent revisionism around the Battle of Kursk, how can the sources be distorted to show the opposite of what actually happened? Which I think is a big question for us all. Mike, would you want to come in on this one, or?
Yeah. Well, this is gosh, I don't want to plunge you into a massive technical issues. The Battle of Kursk. So this is the summer of 1943, and after Stalingrad, the Germans had to some extent recovered. Huge credit to Field Marshal Manstein, who retook the Donetsk and recaptured Kharkov. And the Germans, it's a sign of their military strength that they still went on the offensive in July 1943. So that was the beginning of the Battle of Kursk. But of course, the Red Army had made a conscious decision to let the Germans go on the offensive. So the second part of Kursk, which is the Red Army counterattack, is left out. So from a Russian point of view, the Battle of Kursk starts 4th, 5th of July and goes on to the 23rd of August, probably for the liberation of Orel and Belgorod. But we take the German view, so we start on the 4th and finish on the 13th of July, when the Germans started retreated. Well, that was all part of the plan. So that's the bigger picture. It's quite extraordinary. There has been a big debate about the southern salient. So the Germans were trying to pincer the Red Army to the north and to the south. And it was in the south, at Prokhorovka, that there was a big tank battle. And there's been a lot of discussion about this. And I don't want, it's a bog of statistics, were there more tanks being destroyed or less? But the reality is that the Red Army were confident enough to let the Germans attack, blunt the strength of their armor. And I'm talking about some pretty ferocious new tanks and guns, and then go on the counterattack. So for me, it's about the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is that after the 13th of July, when the Red Army goes on the counterattack, the Germans never, ever, until the end of the war, launch another offensive. And I think that speaks for itself.
Phil, do you want to come in?
I was just going to say, I mean, I don't know about Kursk, but I do know a little bit about sources. And there's a very interesting example of how they're handled going on right now. Towards the end of December 2019, I believe it was the Russian embassy in Bulgaria, decided to hold a public exhibition on the theme of victory. And they were amazed that the Foreign Office, which called the Russians in, the Bulgarian Foreign Office, to complain about aggressive propagandizing. And this was just purely an exhibition about the liberation of the country. In response, the Bulgarians have produced a counter exhibition which relates to genocide 1944 to 1955. So that's one way of dealing with your sources. You actually avoid most of the war altogether when you're fighting on the wrong side. And then you promote a version that has absolutely no relation to the rest of the world's discussion or analysis of what genocide actually is. And I think this is a measure of the people that we are up against, which is why I've tried to say, don't get drawn in on the sucker punch and argue the pros and cons of the German-Soviet pact. We need to look at the flow of the history of the war as a whole and say it as it is, not the way they want us to say it. And I think that the library can play a big role in helping promote good quality and genuine historical investigation and explaining to ordinary people how archives are kept and how they're made available. So many of the papers that we want access to write the history are still not available to scholars in this country.
Jonathan, were you looking like you wanted to come in?
No, that's fine.
Yeah, needless to say, I mean, Phil, I was going to say exactly the same thing. The question of sources brings us back to the importance of the role of our organisations, the SCRSS and the Marx Memorial Library, that literally house and safeguard those documents and records that historians and people should go back to and revisit. I've got a question here. I'm East German and work on the historical memory of the GDR. In Germany, it is considered to be inappropriate to level communism with National Socialism. Does Germany support the Prague Declaration?
There's a very quick answer to that, which is that one of the reasons that Germany has that approach to the Prague Declaration is because there's a powerful labour movement that understands the issues and puts an alternative. Where the Prague Declaration is strongest is where the labour movements are weak or in some cases have been destroyed, like in Bulgaria, like in Estonia, like in Lithuania. And also, sadly, where the Jewish voice is greatly reduced. So there are some very brave people that are still arguing the toss in countries like Lithuania, but the alternative isn't that great. The simple answer is, if you go online, the signatories to the Prague Declaration are public, and you will see there are Germans there. There are Social Democrats and especially the Greens like the Prague Declaration for some reason. But you can also look at the voting record of the MEPs from last year, and that will show you that in very big numbers, apart voted for it. But I don't think that stigmatizes the Germans. The problem for us is that pretty much everybody voted for it, including the Labour Party in this country, which shows what a job of work we'll have yet to do.
Does anyone else want to come in on this one? Right, we've got plenty more. I think we've got about 5 more minutes, so I'll just move on to the next one. Was the turning point the stopping of Operation Barbarossa at the gates of Leningrad? Mike, do you want to come in on this?
Well, Operation Barbarossa stopped at Leningrad, the gates of Leningrad, in September 1941 to put the city under siege rather than take it by storm. So I don't see that very much as a turning point, because the plan was simply to starve the entire population. And I would add, this comes from German archive sources and the records of the Army Group North, that the army discussed the fact that they wouldn't even accept the unconditional surrender of the city, and formulated very serious measures for the fact that if unarmed civilians tried to break out in desperate starvation, it might be quote unquote demoralizing to order German troops to machine gun them. So a satisfactory, this is a direct quote, a satisfactory solution was found, they'd be shelled by artillery units instead. So I wouldn't really see that as a turning point. We're talking about Leningrad, but I do think the defeat of the German army group center at Moscow was a turning point. Vast amounts of manpower and particularly equipment was lost, so that it was a very important military defeat. But to give you an idea, the attack strength, which for a German motorized division is attack readiness, dropped massively in 1942 because units were so under strength in fast moving units. And the only part of the front that the Germans could advance in 1942 was the southern one towards Stalingrad, and in the center they were on the defensive. So yes, if we're talking about Moscow, the failure to capture Moscow, it was an extraordinary moment. But personally, I believe that Stalingrad was the real psychological and moral turning point. An entire German army was surrounded, forced to surrender. This was the invincible German Sixth Army. Hitler boasted that the army was so strong that it could capture the very gates of heaven itself. Well, that went rather badly wrong at Stalingrad. So I see Stalingrad as the turning point.
Anyone else want to come in on this one? No. We've got a big question I think brings us all up to date to current challenges now, which I think we'll end on. This is a very big one. Is fascism a phenomenon worldwide once again? If so, why? Jonathan, do you want to come in on this one?
Okay, yeah. You have to, I mean, yes and no, in that I think it is important to be precise in a way about what we mean when we say fascism, and the difference, the qualitative difference that takes place when fascists control state power to when they are a force in the political current. I think that if you, rather than answer that question exactly, is directly, I would say that the forces that produced fascism are playing themselves out on a global scale now, and you have the potential for not just fascists in government, but you have the potential for a return of real fascist state power as this crisis plays itself out, because the same forces that turned those fascist political forces into acceptable faces of monopoly of big business power in Europe in the 1930s, those same forces are playing themselves out, I think, across a lot of the global economy. So I think it is a very real threat and a very real possibility, and that's, I think, that has to be the mobilizing issue around which we try to contest this territory, because the erasure of the barbarism, the extent of barbarism, and the degradation of the human race that took place under as a consequence of fascism is unthinkable on the scale on which it would be played out today.
Phil, did you want to come in?
I've just finished a chapter in a new book, A Centenary History of the CP, warts and all, before you all ask. And there's a little paragraph in there that I'd pick out for you, and it's, in 1944, the Communist Party wrote, "On this May Day, we think not only of the fascist enemy in Germany and Japan, but of the reactionaries in Britain. They still sit in the boardrooms and employers' organisations where once they gladly negotiated with the international cartels set up by the Nazis to paralyze the defense of democracy. They still own newspapers with which they tried to poison the independent spirit of our people. Let us never forget, reaction may be down, but it is not yet out. Now, reaction isn't fascism, but I think that we have reaction here. And I think that given the right conditions, and in countries where the labour movements are weak, Ukraine, Lithuania, Hungary, Poland, that's lost so much of its youth, I think there is a danger now that that unfinished business of 1945 could lead to border conflicts and could lead to real problems for progressive people.
Thanks, Phil. Mike, would you like to come in on this one at all? Not fine. Well, I think now I'd like to invite our panelists just to make any kind of closing remarks. Mike, do you want to start with that, or Phil?
No, over to Mike.
We're being very polite here. Right. I want to say thank you so much to the other speakers, and just repeat once again what has been said already. Let's never forget the scale of the sacrifice of the Soviet Union, the Great Patriotic War, and our mutual cooperation. It should be one of our greatest assets. That if fascism had won in the 20th century, we wouldn't be having this discussion. We'd be back in the Dark Ages. And it's perhaps one of the greatest achievement of the 20th century that we all fought together and destroyed fascism for that period of time. And let us fight to honor the memory of what happened in the war in terms of the Great Patriotic War, but in terms of also our cooperation, West, Britain, America, and the Red Army. That's it.
Phil?
I'd like to say that, and I want to underline this, that the Prague Declaration movement is not a shadowy organisation. So I'm not talking about guys in suits pulling wires and manipulating governments. They're a pretty open bunch. You can go online and find out about them. You can find out their policies, their discussions, how they network, who they influence. And I really would urge you to do that because they're setting the pace. I believe that even seasoned anti-fascist organisations in this country have been caught sleeping at their post. And they're looking for boot boys on the ground. And all the while, this discussion was going on in really senior circles amongst governments, was how to culturally and historically prepare the ground for changing the way their people saw their country. And they were going to do that from the beginning by wiping out their war record. And that's something that we now have to be on guard against. If I'm allowed to use the phrase going forward, I think there are certain things that the library does brilliantly. I think this is one of them. So thank you so much to all of you and to my fellow speakers and to Marion, of course, for the participation. But I don't think we should just leave it at this evening. And I think that there are things, if, as Ralph said, it's the 80th anniversary next year, couldn't we try to have a representative symposium bringing together veterans groups, Jewish organisations, anti-fascist organisations, scholars, to look at the history of the outcome of the Second World War? Would it be possible to make some of the documents that were around at the time online and easily accessible? I know the transcripts of the Nuremberg trials were translated into English by the Soviets and have since been uploaded free and online. Could we have a page on the website that makes some of these resources available? I'm hoping I'm not volunteering Marianne for too much more work. Somebody who does an incredible job already, but I would happily volunteer to help if I could.
Thanks very much, Phil. I was going to leave this to right till the end, but I completely agree. This can't just be a conversation on an anniversary. This has to be the beginning of something much bigger and more ambitious in terms of the collaboration between the organisations we set out and those that you just mentioned, Phil. It's part of all of our organisation's remits, and it's absolutely vital that we keep working together on this. So I hope we can have some follow-up conversations in the coming weeks and months. Jonathan, would you like to come in?
Well, just very quickly to pick up where Phil left off, really, I think we have I completely agree. We've got to build from here, and I think that there are, to me, just to reiterate, there are three jobs. I think one is clearly to expose the war record of fascism, and that its role in the war and its record of atrocities. The second is to deepen that and the historical knowledge of what fascism is and was. And then to expose this notion of totalitarianism, because it stops people thinking about the past properly, I think. But the most important thing, I think, more than anything else, is that we need to be as organised as the Prague Declaration movement are. And we need to be thinking, we don't have the access to state power that they have, but we need to be thinking about what are the institutions that we need to influence, who are the people, the people who we need to persuade, how do we get access to those people, and how do we target them, because that organisation will be the difference.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Ralph, would you like to have the final word?
Thank you, Marion. Well, first of all, thank you for hosting and doing a marvellous job chairing. I know that we're all catching up very rapidly on the whole online meeting and how to deal with them. I think the chat has been fascinating watching that through the whole event. And I think I would agree with you that our two organisations and others, not least because we have the physical materials, the books, the articles. I mean, Phil talked about contemporaneous archive documents. These are the kinds of things that we both hold, and maybe we can work on a project to get some of those online, because whenever I read materials from that period, it's that the sense of urgency in the 1930s about the dangers that were being faced. It wasn't a great surprise to many on the left, and in the Soviet Union, the rise of fascism, and also the materials through the Second World War. And it's fascinating to see them as they were written at the time. So I think we both of us can perhaps work on some kind of joint project in terms of getting that material more accessible. And of course, as with both of us, the more people get involved, volunteer, support financially or whatever, both organisations, the more that we can both do in terms of supporting a drive towards more information, more knowledge about what happened and what we can do about it. Anyway, thank you, Marion.
Thank you, Ralph. Just to end on a massive thank you to all our panellists. It's been a really fascinating discussion. I'm so pleased that the technology has meant that we can actually all be kind of virtually in the same room. So thank you very much. And yeah, this is the beginning of many more conversations, I think.
Right, okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much, all of you.
Cheers.
Right.